so-called numerus clausus came in existence, which meant that only 6% of the Jewish youngsters can go to the universities because the Jewish population was 6%. Little after that, it was the numerus nullus, which meant that no Jewish youngsters could go to the universities. They closed up the Jewish schools, and my education began at home, when our teachers came and gave lectures in our homes. That's when it hit me that I am less than a free citizen. After that, I started signs in restaurants which said no gypsies, no dogs, and no Jews are allowed in this place. And I think that was our status in Hungary. We came after the gypsies and after the dogs. My father's store was taken away, traveling was restricted, and life became very, very hard and difficult. At that time, I started taking the Jewish youngsters in camps. Those were not extermination camps. Those were work camps. That was the time when Germany occupied the Ukraine, and I established work camps there. Now, I come from a family where there are a lot of furriers. Now, my two uncles and my husband were furriers, and they were taken to the Ukraine, where they worked in fur shop, repairing or making mittens and hats in preparation of the Russian invasion. We still could keep in touch with them. I got letters, I was able to send food to them. And we thought that since they certainly could be in the Hungarian army, that was the way to serve their country. My husband was for 26 months in this work camp. After 26 months he came home, and exactly 1 month to the day, they took him to Yugoslavia, to Bor, into a salt mine. I know that for a fact, that's where he was, because my brother was also taken, and they were together there in Bor. From then on, I never heard of him, I never saw him, and I only have a faint idea what happened to him because he didn't come home alive. My brother, who was 14 years old, was taken from the Jewish school. We know that that's where he was taken from, because when he didn't come home from the school, we started calling other people whose children went to the Hebrew school, and none of them came home. This child was 14 years old, a lovable, lovely, bright youngster. He came home from Bor, an old little broken man, and even today he cannot adjust to normal life. He's extremely overweight. He does not go anywhere. He does not do anything. He just survives. So when they ask me how many of your family was destroyed at the concentration camp or during the Holocaust, I always count my brother in, because he didn't have a happy day of his life since he was taken. Now, my husband was in Bor, as I said, and one day orders came to leave Bor, and they start marching them towards Germany. But I am telling you now, I know because only one person survived this ordeal, and he came home and he told us. One night on their march, they were 500 people. They took them in a factory where they used to make bricks. And they were sleeping 20 to a group in one of those places where they prepared the bricks. In the middle of the night, they took them out 20 by 20 by 20, and they shot them to death. This man who came home climbed up on a tree, and that's how he escaped, and that's how he came home and bear witness to what happened. Well, in my heart of hearts, I am hoping that my husband was in that 250 who was killed, because that was the easy way to die, because the rest of them were marched to Bergen-Belsen, never to be seen anymore. We are not even sure that it was Bergen-Belsen, because there was not one survivor who came back. We are just guessing, because there were some rumors that those people were seen there. Now, many times I heard the question, how is it possible that a civilized country like Germany, how was it possible that the Holocaust could occur? Now maybe you want to ask, how is it possible that Hungary, which counted to the civilized countries, were capable to turn against its own citizens? And as you will later hear, it took a Swedish man to save 100,000 of us, and the Hungarian government was able to kill close to 2 million. As you probably know, Hungary is located in the center of Europe, and I always call Hungary a schizophrenic country. For years and years, it belonged to Austro-Hungary and was always a lower class country. The Austrian looked down at the Hungarians and said they belong to the Balkan. The Hungarians, on the other hand, hated the Romanians, hated everything what was Balkan. They wanted desperately to belong to the West, and they never been accepted. And being a highly Catholic country, they had a real hatred against Lutherans and Jews. All their frustration of being second-grade citizens was poured on their own second-grade citizens. And even though there was always one or two Jewish or Lutheran person in the higher echelon, the rest was looked down. So when the Germans promised that the territories which were taken away after First World War and given to Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, that these territories will be returned, Miklos Horthy, who was the head of the government, made a pact with the Axis. Now they were good servants to the Germans, so they didn't have the need to occupy Hungary. But in 1944, Miklos Horthy tried to cut his ties with Germany, but it was so poorly prepared that it came to nothing, and the Hungarian Nazi Party, the so-called, close it for a minute.
Arrow cross.
The so-called arrow cross. I imagine I have a mental block against them. Arrow cross with a head named Szálasi came to power, and that's when the real trouble began in 1944, June 6, 1944. The Jews had to move into so-called Jewish houses, which had a yellow star on them, have to wear a yellow star. Those who turned Catholic, which was plenty, they had to wear a white armband. The Jewish houses were only open between 2 and 5 o'clock, when we could have done the shopping. But as I said, the Hungarians were real anti-Semites, so they made a point that they closed the food shop, all the shops what we needed to survive, they were closed between 2 and 5. So we were only on the mercy of some of the people who would bring us food. Of course, well, June 6th, 1944, the real trouble began. Miklos Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary and who wanted to cut his ties with Germany, abdicated, and the Arrow Cross took over. Now, they did a real good, thorough job. In some ways, they were much better than the Germans in killing and exterminating the Jews, because in such a short time, percentage-wise, they were able to kill more Jewish people than the Germans did in their own country and the occupied territories. The wagons started to roll in to the station, the cattle cars. There were 80 people to one cattle car, were loaded with no facilities, no water, no food. As I understand, the lucky ones died in the cattle cars, and there were plenty of them, because after they left the cattle cars, they were taken. They discovered that they're either in Auschwitz or Buchenwald or Bergen-Belsen. But as you know from many, many documentary movies, they were separated from the families. The weak ones, the old ones, the children were burned, and the able-bodied people were put to work with very little food, and one by one, they died from starvation or exhaustion. Additional to the misery, but the Germans dished them out, they were very much haunted by the inmates who were there already for months and years, and they felt very jealous of the Hungarian Jews who were still well fed, who were able to bring some warm clothes with them. And as human nature will be, they were jealous at them that they are going to survive a little longer. This is the time when Raoul Wallenberg came to Hungary. As you know, he was Swedish, and he was chosen for the job because as a young man, he worked in Israel, which was called at that time Palestine, where he met several refugees who were escaping from Germany at that time. He also had a Hungarian friend named Lantos, with whom he went in business, in the food business. And through Lantos he was in Budapest meeting a few people on his business trips. He was in his early 30s. And when I saw him, he looked to me very tall, but I understand he was not exceptionally tall. But the Hungarian people are short and stocky and dark, and he was blond and slim and carried himself beautifully. So he looked like a wonderfully tall, broad person who walked straight. He was just lovely looking. I saw him on the platform where they were loading the juice into the cattle car. Now you have to remember that we knew that this is the way to misery and death. Somewhere inside of our brain was burned, don't get on the cattle car. Do anything what you possibly humanly can, just don't get on the cattle car. Now where they were loading the poor victims, they were Aerocross people all over with their guns, with their rifles, the most brutally pushing and shoving the people, because 80 people are not easy to shove in the cattle car. And there stood in the midst of that mayhem, there stood Wallenberg, tall and blond, unarmed, with his Schutzpasses in his hand, and started pulling people off, handing out the Schutzpasses. Now you have to know that a Schutzpass, which meant that you are an honorary Swedish citizen, it was a big hoax. It was the genius of Wallenberg who designed a very impressive looking document with the Swedish colors, beautifully printed, which had really no other value that impressed the Hungarians who could hardly read, and very easily impressed with anything that beautiful as this document was. The second genius was that Wallenberg bought up a section of the city, which was a very modern part of the best part of Budapest, where mostly well-to-do Jews used to live. They were already taken to the concentration camp, and those houses were abandoned. So Wallenberg bought those houses, flew the Swedish flag, and people who were lucky enough to have the Schutzpasses moved in there. Of course the houses were beautiful and the apartments were lovely, but they were about 30 to 35 people crammed into. We didn't complain because we were safe, but you have no idea what does it mean for 30 to 35 people to use one bathroom, to sleep in kitchens, in entrance halls, on the floor. We actually took turns to sleep in the bed, which was about every other week. You slept one night in the bed. Food was very scarce, but we still were very grateful because we have some kind of dignity and security. Now, Wallenberg was absolutely superhuman. When the man slept, we don't know, because he was roaming the streets, looking out for groups of people who were taken to be loaded on the cattle cars. He pulled them off from trucks. He handed out his schutzpasses. And of course, he tried to save as many young people as possible, because that's where the future was. At the beginning of the end, they were stopped sending the cattle cars because the railroads were bombed and there was no way to send into Hungary the cattle cars. And that's when the poor, miserable people, anybody with a yellow star, or, oh, I have to tell you that there was an assigned place, several streets and several buildings, which they were, Jews used to live before the Holocaust began. That was assigned for the Budapest ghetto. And anybody who didn't have a Schutzpass was crowded in the ghetto, and from there they were taken to the cattle cars. Now when the run of the train stopped, they went into the ghetto, got the people out, took them over to the Buda side of Budapest, and started walking them towards Austria and into the camps. Now that was a real dead march, because Hungary the weather starts being very cold in September, and October and November it's really below freezing. Now those people had no comfortable shoes to walk, they had no warm clothing, they were old, they were already hungry in the ghetto, there was no food provided for them. They dropped by the hundreds and maybe by the thousands on this dead march. Now Wallenberg saw that he and the Swedish consulate cannot handle this kind of crisis. So he talked to the head of the Swede consulate. The consul's name was Lutz. And he talked him into giving some kind of resembling thing to a Schutzpass. And from the Swedish and the Swiss consulate, there were cars going on the route where the people marched. They pulled people from the dead march. They handed them their Schutzpasses and took them to the safe houses. I understand there were as many as 300-400, maybe 500 people saved in those few days. Wallenberg also managed to get 2 Red Cross ambulances who were following these cars. So, people often ask me if it's not a slight exaggeration that Wallenberg saved 100,000 people. Well, let me tell you how this was possible. First of all, I told you about the Dead March, where we saved between 300 and 500 people. And then in the safe houses, they were off and on several thousand people. Some of them stayed there for all the while. Some of them were hiding out later somewhere else. And Wallenberg roamed the street and pulled off people from trucks. His biggest sorrow came one day, and that was the day before Christmas, when he saw a truck full of youngsters being taken from wherever they were hiding, or maybe from the ghetto. He pulled off those youngsters put them in a safe house. Now obviously the Arrow Cross was celebrating on Christmas Day the birth of their Savior. And what could be better celebration than spill the blood of young Hungarian boys? They went into the safe house and killed those youngsters except one, who I understand lives now in New York and bears witness that those young people were killed on Christmas Day. Now it came the time when the Russians were closing in Budapest. Now you must know that Hitler was so dead set to wipe out this last remaining pocket of Jews alive that he sent his henchman Adolf Eichmann for the final solution. In January, when the Russians closed in, Eichmann left, but he appointed his assistant to be, and gave the orders to be sure that the ghetto will be destroyed before the Russians occupy Budapest. They put a wire fence around the few streets which were the ghetto houses there. The Arrow Cross was to be outside to be sure that nobody escapes, and the SS would move into the ghetto and eliminate the thousands of Hungarian Jews. There were about 90,000 Jews there. I have to tell you about the conditions in these ghetto houses, because one of the houses were inside the ghetto where my sister used to live before she got her Schutzpass. There were 40-45 people in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment with one toilet. The filth, the hunger, the starvation, the inhumanity one against the other were undescribable. After the Russians liberated us, we moved in. I moved in with my sister in her apartment. The cockroaches and the bedbugs were overrunning the place. There was no electricity, there was no gas. Now this is the way people lived week in and week out, waiting for the moment when they will be picked up and loaded in the cattle cars or put in one of those dead marches. So anyways, these people were condemned to die before the Russians came. Now Wallenberg had and the Jews had the great luck that he befriended a woman whose husband was an aristocrat and worked with the Arrow Cross. But after a while, when he saw the ruthless killings and the way people were handled, he couldn't stand it. And he gave reports to Wallenberg what goes on. And he was telling about this extermination plan. Now Wallenberg risked his life to make contact with Adolf Eichmann's deputy. He certainly risked his life because there were several attempts to assassinate him. But he did make contact with the man and started talk to him sense and says, look, you are an SS man. Your days are numbered. Once the Russians come, you are not going to survive the first 24 hours. You be smart. Don't obey these orders. And I promise you, I will bear witness that you saved those 90,000 people's life. Just ignore the order. And the man did. And this is how Wallenberg came to save 100,000 people during the few months till he was there. In January, the Russians liberated Budapest. I use the word liberated because this is how we felt, because we knew that in a few more days or a few very short weeks, no matter how Wallenberg tried, there was just no way that thousands upon thousands of people would be exterminated, because at that time the Nazis already did not obey the Schutzpass either. Sometimes they came into the safe houses, took the people, and since there was nowhere to put them, the ghetto was chock full, the dead marches had to stop because the Russians were approaching. They plain shot the people in the Danube. Now in best of times, the so-called blue Danube is never blue. It's really grey or brown, but at that time it turned red from the human blood because people were shot. I saw 14, 15-year-old kids carrying guns which were bigger than they were, herding 10 or 15 people and shooting them into the Danube. Well, Wallenberg's tragedy began when the Russians occupied Budapest. Everybody was telling Wallenberg to leave the country because he is going to be accused of being an American spy, because he was sent by the American Jewish Committee. But Wallenberg felt that his job is not finished yet. He figured that survivors of the labor camps and the extermination camps will come back, and I need his help to get jobs or have their apartments back. And he was pretty sure if he could handle the Germans, he would handle the Russians too. Well, little he knew that the Russians are no better than the Germans. He had an appointment to meet the head of the Russian occupation forces. He was driven to meet him, and that was the last time I saw him alive. As we understand, he was taken to the Lublanka prison in Moscow. The Swedish consulate tried everything possible to make contact with him. First they were assured that he is only being interrogated and then he will be able to go back to Sweden. Few weeks later, they said they never had him, they don't know who he is, and he never was in Russia. After a while, they kept saying that he had a heart attack and he is dead. But even as late as 1983, there were people who heard of him or saw him. He's supposed to be in Lublanka for a long while, then he was taken to Siberia, and in 1983, a man who was in prison and then went to Israel reported to the Swiss consulate in Israel that he knows for a fact that a Swedish man who claimed that he saved thousands and thousands of Hungarian people is there inside Siberia in prison. So all I can tell you without being pathetic, or I would give 5 years of my life, remaining life, if I could see Wallenberg alive, that I would go up to him and say, thank you for my life, thank you for my child, thank you for my grandchildren, and thank you for the nice, beautiful, comfortable life that I have for my old age. And thank you to let me survive the war and make a good person out of a spoiled little Jewish princess, which I used to be when I was home. Now I can work for sick people, which I do twice a week. I work for the terminally ill people. Now I can work in a soup kitchen, which I do twice a week, in a home for the homeless. Now I can play my bridge. Now I can paint. Now I can have friends. And to fulfill my wish, I pray to God that Raoul Wallenberg should come home and we can all see home.